Canada just made a bold move that could change everything. Instead of relying on one powerful neighbor, it is opening new doors across the world. This could give Canada more strength and freedom, while the US may lose a partner it once depended on. What happens next could reshape the future for both countries. Prime Minister Mark Carney stood at the University of Ottawa and said something no. Canadian Prime Minister has said in the modern age of North American trade. The many decades-long move toward a closer and closer economic relationship between Canada and the United States is over. Not paused, not being reviewed over. Carney gave a clear goal that night. Double Canada's exports to countries outside the US within the next decade. When he said it, more than 75% of everything Canada sells to the world was going to one buyer. The plan announced that night was to cut that dependence in half. The number that shapes this whole story is 75%. For more than 100 years, the United States has been Canada's main customer by far, at times making up as much as 80 to 85% of all Canadian exports during times of peak economic connection. As of late 2025, more than 75% of Canadian exports still go to the United States. Canada is the #1 export destination for 36 American states. Almost 3.6 billion Canadian dollars, about 2.7 billion US dollars, in goods and services crosses the border every single day. That amount of daily trade working together is what a century of economic closeness creates. And that closeness is exactly what Carney now calls Canada's main weakness. The jobs of workers in our industries hit hardest by US tariffs. Autos, steel, lumber are under threat. Our businesses are holding back investments because of the cloud of uncertainty hanging over all of us. Carney said the reason for the change was clear and tied to a specific moment. American tariffs on Canadian autos, steel, aluminum, and lumber, raised to levels Carney said had not been seen since the Great Depression, turned a structural strength into a structural risk overnight. A trade relationship built on the belief of smooth cross-border integration cannot handle tariffs of 25 to 50% without the smaller country in that relationship suffering much more damage. Canadian auto plants are making about 30% fewer vehicles than the year before. Algoma Steel reported a 1 in 59, $4 million net loss in one single quarter with $27.4 million in direct tariff costs. The risk Carney pointed to was not just an idea. It was already appearing in quarterly earnings reports. By April 2026, Carney made the message even sharper. Speaking just days after winning a majority government following special election victories, he described Canada's economic relationship with the United States in very direct words. What used to be a strength has become a weakness. We have to take care of ourselves because we cannot depend on one foreign partner, he said. The US has changed and we must respond. It's about taking back control of our security, our borders, and our future. That statement, given with a new election mandate, turned the diversification strategy from a policy idea into a governing mission with the political support to carry it out. The travel schedule around the world that followed in October 2025 shows how big the diversification push really was. Carney traveled to China in January 2026. That was an important place to go, given Canada's long history of being careful about deeper economic ties with China, and it drew attention because Canada had not seen the United States as a military threat since the mid-1800s, yet it was now managing a growing trade relationship with China, while American talk about Greenland and control over the continent shook old beliefs about North American security. We are re-engaging with the global giants India and China, Carney said in October 2025. He named the two most populated countries on Earth as clear targets of Canada's diversification plan. The Indo-Pacific part of the strategy goes beyond China and includes Japan, Australia, and India as key parts of Canada's long-term economic plan. At the same time, Canada is also working more closely with Europe. The Canada-EU Security and Defense Partnership signed in December 2025 opened the door to defense industry cooperation, and Canada's wider trade diversification toward Europe includes aluminum, hydrogen, and critical minerals partnerships that moved faster through 2026. Each of these relationships creates exportability that does not depend on choices made in Washington. The home country part of Carney's strategy is where the diversification effort becomes deeply important in structure instead of just being active diplomacy. On March 21, 2025, in his first meeting with Canada's premiers, Carney promised what he called Free Trade by Canada Day, removing federal barriers to interprovincial trade and labor movement by July 1, 2025. The agreement is to turn what has been a concept into a reality that will diversify and strengthen our economy, Carney said at that meeting. We are committing to removing all federal exemptions under the Canada Free Trade Agreement. The Free Trade and Labor Mobility in Canada Act received royal assent on June 26, 2025, removing all federal exceptions under the Canadian Free Trade Agreement and creating the Canadian Internal Trade Data and Information Hub. The economic estimate tied to full internal trade liberalization is very large. Removing all federal, provincial, and territorial internal trade barriers could raise Canadian GDP by as much as $200 billion over time, equal to $5,100 per person. Internal trade expert Ryan Manuka explained the real meaning of the federal law very clearly. It's a starting gun, and it's starting a lot more activity and work, which is honestly the really exciting part. If any of this were easy, it would have been done. The fine print matters here. Carney's promise of free trade by Canada Day was aimed specifically at federal-level barriers, the rules that Ottawa controls. Most of Canada's internal trade barriers exist at the provincial level under the Canadian Free Trade Agreement that took effect in 2017, and that agreement still gives provinces a lot of room to protect local industries through exceptions. Canada's supply-managed dairy and poultry sectors remain completely outside this liberalization. Provinces such as Nova Scotia, Quebec, and Ontario have signed bilateral memorandums of understanding and brought in laws removing some of their own exceptions. But a fully open, barrier-free internal Canadian market still does not exist. In Manuka's words, this is the start of a conversation, not the final answer. The strategic logic connecting internal trade reform to the larger diversification push is simple and direct. A Canadian company that can sell freely into every province without dealing with province-specific certification, licensing, and regulatory rules becomes a bigger and more efficient domestic base, better able to grow into export markets in Europe, Asia, and the Indo-Pacific. As we move from reliance to resilience, we are building one Canadian economy so that we can become our own best customer, the federal government said in November 2025. By May 28, 2026, Carney's message had changed even further, still describing the moment not as a trade fight between two countries, but as a world going through a break, forcing Canada to look for a new kind of partnership with the United States instead of trying to bring back the old one. The basic fact of geography that Carney has recognized through this whole process has not changed. The United States shares a 525-mile border with Canada, buys most Canadian exports, and cannot be replaced as a trade partner through diversification alone. Even Carney's own goal, doubling non-US exports by 2035, would still leave the United States as Canada's biggest single trade partner by a wide margin.